Welcome, everybody. I'm David Madison. I'm the Executive Director of the Southwestern Association of Episcopal Schools, and I'm joined today by our Director of Professional Development, Mary Katherine Duffy. Good afternoon, Mary Katherine.
Hello, everyone. Glad to be here.
Well, and thank you all for joining us today. So, our webinar topic today is difficult conversations, strategies that actually work. So, difficult conversations are part of the work that we do, and they may not be the most fun part of the work that we do, but hopefully, we can talk about some strategies so those conversations can happen in a productive way and that you'll have some tools to implement and some strategies to use when you have those difficult conversations. So, that's the goal for today. Before we turn it over to Mary Katherine, I have a couple of items of housekeeping. First, this is being recorded, so a copy of the webinar will be in our webinar library on the website. Also, a copy of the slides will be available in the document library. So certainly take as many notes as you like, but know that you'll be able to access both the recording and the slides on our website. You'll need your login credentials. So in the event you don't have login credentials or need to recover those, just call Pat Blevins in our main office and she will get you all situated. Next, we'll be using the Q&A box today. So on the bottom of your screen, you'll see a button that says Q&A. As questions come up, if there's anything that you'd like to share with either me or with Mary Katherine, or questions you'd like to pose, just type those into the Q&A box and we'll make sure that we get all the questions answered today. So that's it from me. Thank you again so much for joining us. And let me turn it over to Mary Katherine Duffy. MK, take it away.
Well, welcome everyone. It's so great to have you here, and it's because it's an interesting time of year to have. But we do have difficult conversations all year long, as David said, and especially I think in the climate that we've been in, I think this is a particularly timely topic. And as we were talking in the beginning, this little guy that I have on the screen right here, he's one of my favorites because I feel like that this is the face that lots of people make when they know they have to have a difficult conversation. So these are some other faces that people make when they have to have a difficult conversation. And as David said, one of the things that I think struck me when I started being a head of school was the number of difficult conversations that I would have to have. And I didn't know that was going to be the case. And I think that's why this webinar is so important and why people sign up for it, because I don't know a lot of people that look at this kind of situation and go, oh, I'm super excited to get to do that. There's so many emotions around it. You're either mad about it, or you're upset, or you're stressed, or you feel anxious. All of these pictures kind of represent the feelings that any of us have when we have to have a conversation that's going to be hard. So we're going to have a poll question in just a minute, but I want to talk a little bit about some in my experience as a head of school where I found that there was rich soil for difficult conversations. Obviously, a parent-teacher comes to mind when you think about parent-teacher conferences, where most of us do parent-teacher conferences in the fall, and they're mandatory. And this is a time in which we're trying to talk to parents about kind of the things that we see. We always want to try to talk about the things that we see that are good, but oftentimes we have to have conversations that are difficult about a child that may be struggling in an area. So that's a definite rich soil for this kind of conversation. Student teachers are also, I think, an opportunity, a relationship that can be, especially in an older, I think, David, you did middle and high school, you saw more older kids. When you have to have a conversation with a kid about something that's hard, that can be difficult. Not so much in early learning, but in the older kids.
Sure.
Parent administrators, obviously, this is a big one. This was one I dealt with on the regular. Parents who were frustrated with something we did at the school, frustrated with the teacher, frustrated with the policy. Teacher administrators, things that when you have to, as an administrator, have a conversation with the teacher about the way they're teaching, or something they did that may not have been within your policy. If you're a head of school, there's obviously opportunity for you to have a hard conversation with a board member. There can be board member conversations. And then finally, the old head of school rector conversation, which we have offered at least 2 webinars on this relationship and how difficult conversations can often arise in this relationship. So I'd like to run a poll question really quickly. And I'm going to try to make sure that I said this. In what relationship do you most commonly have a difficult conversation? So if you're a head of school or if you're a teacher, where do you find that you most, this happens most? Which relationship?
Our
Teachers,
poll's
parents,
open.
board members, administrators, or students?
So if everyone will answer that question and click in the poll, we'll give it another 15 seconds or so. Okay, let's see what everyone says.
Parents, yes. Yeah, I think that that's not at all surprising, because that's really, in this environment. And something that occurred to me last night from our parent meeting last night was just the reality of the anxiety that parents have just across the board creates even more opportunity for this kind of difficult conversation. So thanks for that. Okay, let me go to the next slide here. Okay, so situations that you might find where you have difficult that would require a difficult conversation. I was trying to think of situations in which I, as a teacher, or again, as an administrator, when you have a student that's failing because of attitude, that's kind of one of those things that I was thinking about with when you have an older group of students, and you have to have a conversation about, hey, your attitude is the problem, not necessarily your aptitude. When you are a teacher, this is something that came up for us on the regular, and it was teachers that suspected a learning issue, and they did not know how to have that conversation with a parent, because as teachers, we're not diagnosticians. We just suspect something's awry. And that conversation was always one that was a challenge. A parent that's angry with a teacher. I mean, this can be a teacher-parent conversation, or it can be a parent conversation with an administrator, but this is a very common one. And I suspect this is what we're talking about in that poll question, was parents that are frustrated or anxious or angry with the way something's gone in the classroom. Administrators giving performance evaluations. This is something often that I see when administrators really struggle with this, and so they don't do it. So, and we're going to talk about kind of ways that don't work. And so administrators giving a very difficult or hard performance evaluation can be hard. And then a board member, for head of school, a board member overstepping his or her boundaries, that can be a real difficult conversation. Hopefully that conversation is being had with the board chair, but sometimes it's a conversation that a head of school has to have. So what are some strategies that we commonly use to deal with difficult situations? And let me just tell you that these are strategies that I would not, I think don't work, okay? But we do use them commonly. Number one, denial. It's very common just to deny the situation even exists, and to just kind of sweep it under the rug, pretend it doesn't exist so you don't have to deal with it. Sarcasm. I found a lot of times, I found this with faculty members who didn't want to have a conversation with a colleague, or they didn't want to have a conversation with a parent. And so they would just deal with it with little sarcasm, little biting remarks. Sometimes we have situations in which we create shame situations for people, where we just kind of embarrass them. Bribery, subtle hints, all of those are kind of the same common strategy for dealing with difficult situations. Group rules or discussion, that's kind of, that was my go-to, if I'm being honest. That was my go-to when I first started as a head of school. I loved to call faculty meetings and kind of call out situations to the whole faculty that really didn't have anything to do with everybody. It had to do with one or two people. I remember one specific situation in which I had a teacher who was consistently late. And so I just talked about it pretty regular at faculty meetings about we needed to be on time, rather than just deal with that one faculty member. And I'll be honest, it came back to bite me. I had a faculty member who was very upset because she was never late, and she did not appreciate me casting aspersions towards the whole group when she knew very well that there was only one person that was late. And that's basically what she said to me. And you know what? She was absolutely right. And so sometimes we do this not at a faculty meeting, but we send kind of long, drawn out emails. And I really, I don't mind calling myself out and saying this was one of my favorite go-to strategies that quite frankly didn't work. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to show you a video, if I could, that I found. And last time I did this, I had another video, but this one I really like because this was a guy that I found. He did a TED Talk. His name is Adair Cohen, and we're not going to watch all 15 minutes of it. Don't worry, but I do want you to see the first few minutes.
I'm in a concrete maze the size of 72 football fields. I'm being led from checkpoint to checkpoint, and before each door opens, the door behind me slams shut. The lock echoes while I'm searched and interviewed again. It's a maximum security jail, the largest in the country, the Cook County Jail in Chicago, Illinois. I'm here for the meeting, I say again, repeat my credentials. It's my first time visiting a jail, and everyone can tell. They take my phone, they take my keys, and they take my little bag of almonds. Almonds. Finally, I'm left in a room with two men who stare at me as I enter. One is a gang leader, the other is a corrections officer, and each of them is the size of 4 of me, which basically means I'm outnumbered 8-1. Their arms are strapped across their chests, flashes of anger in their eyes. I'm terrified, and I'm thinking they were worried about my almonds? The heavy door behind me slams shut. It's just the 3 of us now. No one moves. Now, who's had the very same experience? But whether you're a C-level executive or a spouse or you're a part of any kind of team, you probably know this to be true, that one conversation can change everything. So I want you to think of a tough conversation that people around you need to have. You got it? There's some issue that's holding them back from accomplishing what they want to accomplish. I believe they might be one conversation away from accomplishing that thing, but they're not having the conversation they need to have, or they've tried and it hasn't gone well. I've led some pretty tough conversations in some pretty tough environments. Northern Ireland, the Middle East, corporate boardrooms. I actually have a PhD in leading difficult conversations, and here's what I've learned. We're not having the conversations we need to have, and that's mostly because we're afraid. We don't want to make things worse. But not having these conversations, or having them poorly, is really bad. And most of us know this from our work. Some issue arises for a team. It could be a minor issue, but it goes unaddressed. Frustration sets in. Communication constricts. Tensions rise. Trust evaporates. And collaboration is done. Remember, we're talking about teams that perform surgeries, land planes, run schools. Many of us are a part of teams that perform crucial functions. We can't afford to avoid tough conversations. So that conversation that you thought of, that people around you need to have, you can lead that conversation. And I'm going to give you 3 simple rules to being vastly more effective in leading it. Wherever you use these rules, at work, at home, people are going to thank you. And then they'll start reaching goals they couldn't reach before, and they will come and find you and thank you again. And you'll benefit because the people around you will be more successful, not miserable, which makes your life better. So, The 3 rules. Rule number 1, move toward the conflict. Most of us don't like conflict, but it's normal, healthy, and totally human. Without conflict, problems hide everywhere. Big problems, problems we all want to solve. So, conflict is information. And handled well, conflict is opportunity. So rather than running from it or pretending it's not there, move toward it. More on this in a minute. But rule number 2, you don't know anything. And even if you do, pretend you don't. Ask questions about people's experiences and listen to what they say. Important things will be said because you're there listening, and the better you listen, the better the people having the conversation will listen to each other. And finally, rule 3, keep quiet. Don't panic in the few seconds it takes for people to respond. They just need time. If you're jumpy about pauses, they'll see that and lose confidence in the conversation. Some of the best breakthroughs I've seen in really difficult conversations have emerged out of a brief period of silence. Don't rush in to rescue everyone from that awkward moment. It's your job to show them that moment is okay.
Okay, so I think that I hope that you'll take the time to go back and watch the whole thing, because that whole thing is he tells some really important stories around his experience at the Cook County Jail, and he tells another story. But I just loved this video because I loved the 3 things that he said, and the reason I think I liked them is because they're things that I don't want to do. And so I want to talk about these 3 things, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about some other strategies. And so the first one is to move toward conflict. That was the first rule he talked about. And quite frankly, that's not what we tend to do. That's not what we want to do. I think that most of us, I'll speak for me only, but I would think most of us, our first response when there's conflict is to run away from it and to avoid it and to hope that it'll go away. And the reality is that there are problems that need to be solved, and there are conversations that need to be had that will make everything better, but you have to move toward it. And so I loved that. The second thing is to act as if you don't know anything, even if you do. Now, I liked this too, because this is not my nature at all. My nature is to try to problem solve. And then finally, to keep quiet. And we're going to talk about each one of these individually, but keeping quiet, I think if anybody knows me at all, they have to know that that's difficult.
Well, and Mary
hard for
Catherine,
me.
honestly, I think the ability to hold silence,
Very
particularly
hard.
in this kind of conversation, just because occasionally you need to take a big deep breath and just let something sit for a couple seconds that the other person has said without immediately reacting, and that's so hard because adrenaline. I mean,
Right.
when you're in, we don't have to get into the nuts and bolts of that, but this brings on a fight or flight response,
Right.
and you've got so much adrenaline in your body, especially if this difficult conversation unfolded in an unplanned way.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we plan difficult conversations. Sometimes we find ourselves in difficult
Right.
conversations, and so that third suggestion that you offer, I think, is so critically important.
Yeah. And we're gonna dig a little deeper into that in just a minute. So let's talk about rule number 1: move toward conflict. What I really liked about what he said was conflict is information, and if handled well, it's opportunity. And what I like about that is that if we change our mindset, and we talk a lot about a growth mindset, we talk a lot about the way we see a perspective. If you use this opportunity to change your mindset around conflict, what you'll find is that the goal of conflict oftentimes is to get information and to solve a problem, right? And I liked what he said about that if you know that there's a conversation that you have to have, it's going to solve a problem that everyone has. And so if you can look at it from the perspective of it just being information, it's not good, it's not bad, it's just information. I think it helps us move towards it a little bit better. So the second rule was act as if you don't know anything, even if you do. So again, as David said, this is not the thing that we necessarily all run to, but I've learned a lot about asking questions. And so sometimes we go into situations in which we think we know the answer, we think we know what people think, we think we know all kinds of things. But I would say that even if you do know, asking questions makes people feel heard and listened to. And it's hard. I mean, it's really hard for me. I just want to go in and fix the problem. But the reality is that asking questions about people's experiences and actually listening to what those experiences are will give you information that you actually don't know. And I think this is a mistake that and especially for school heads, because I was one. School heads traditionally are problem solvers. So they want to go in, especially if they know they've been around a long time, they've got a lot of experience, they think they know. But I would argue that this rule is as important as any of them, and that is to just keep asking questions. I would encourage you also to avoid autobiographical listening. So this is something that I struggle with. Autobiographical listening is when you listen to somebody and you kind of insert your own experience into the situation. So for example, you're telling me about your frustration around the teacher not giving enough homework or giving too much homework. And my response is, I understand what you're saying because my kid was in a school where, and then all of a sudden we're talking about me as opposed to talking about what the person that started the conversation is. So I think avoiding autobiographical listening, sometimes I think we think that helps. I don't think it does help, but avoid that. Another tip on this is to give your undivided attention. So I know that we all have these little phones. See this? This little phone can be a real problem. And I have been guilty of it. Another thing that you can be guilty of is your screen. And so I would argue that moving away from your screen and your phone when you're having a conversation and sitting down and giving full undivided attention, looking people in the eye, that's really helpful. And that gives people the confidence to answer questions and to give their experience in a way that you can really hear them if you're not looking at your phone or looking at your screen. The final one on here is the resisting the urge to offer advice or commentary. And again, y'all, this is super hard for me because I have lots of advice to offer and lots of help I can give you if you'll just listen, right? But the reality is that the number one part of this rule is asking questions, not giving advice. Make sense? And then the final one is to keep quiet. And again, with David and I talking about this just a second ago, this awkward silence that we feel we need to fill. It's hard, guys. It's hard to keep quiet when you think that you can solve a problem or help somebody. But number one, don't pretend to know the answer. It's okay if you don't. Just don't pretend. Don't be afraid of the silence, because one of the things that I remember somebody saying to me one time was, if you're always talking and filling that silence, then sometimes it just takes people a little bit to speak up and to say what they want to say. And I didn't really understand that honestly until I had a daughter who does that, and it takes her a minute to think of what it is she wants to say. And if you don't ever give her that minute, then she's not ever going to say it. And so I've learned that as a parent, and I think it translates as a head of school or as a teacher or in whatever role you're in, that to let the silence just sit. I also loved what he said about rushing to rescue people from the awkward moment. I mean, that's kind of like what you said a minute ago, David. No one likes the awkward moment. It's hard. But it's your job to make sure that they know it's okay for there to be silence, right? And I don't know why we want to rush in and make that go away. I think we desperately need for the silence to exist.
Yeah, and it's a situation where, we do want to rush in and be a hero
Hmm.
and try to take away that silence, because we're so, I mean, just as a world, we're uncomfortable with the idea of silence. I mean, think of how how often do you really have true silence without something, music, something in the background?
Right.
It's unusual, and so that's off-putting. But don't rush in as a hero on that.
Yeah.
That silence, that space, I think, is critically important for this type of conversation to unfold.
Yeah. So move towards the conflict. Don't assume you know anything. Assume you know nothing, and keep quiet and let people enter into the situation. So let's look at some other strategies to consider. Um, I think the first one, David kind of alluded to this earlier, but the first one is to prepare yourself emotionally when you're going to have a difficult conversation. And what I mean by that is, yeah, sometimes you can't prepare. Sometimes you've got a mad parent that comes in your office and they're just beside themselves, and you can't go, excuse me, you sit there while I prepare myself emotionally. That you can't do that. But if you know you have to have a hard conversation, whether it's a teacher, it's a parent teacher conference or whatever, prepare yourself emotionally for the situation. Ask yourself, what happened? What emotions am I feeling? Where do I fit into the situation? Now, sometimes, I found it oftentimes as a head of school that I was dealing with situations that were between other people, right? I was a mediator more so than it was about me. But sometimes, and I think this happened to me a lot as a head of school, I was so attached to the school and to the teachers and to the people that I cared about that I would get emotional if you were upset with a teacher of mine, or I would get emotional if I felt like that the school was being attacked in any way. And I think it's really important for you to prepare yourself emotionally and ask yourself kind of what emotions am I feeling, so that you can get a handle on that before you go into the situation. The next thing is around empathy and compassion. And I think that's really, really critical as we walk through this idea of listening and understanding and seeking someone else's perspective. And again, there's a lot of conversation and a lot of learning to be done with Brene Brown. She does a lot of work around empathy and compassion, but I just really believe that if you are in any kind of relationship, whether it's with teachers, whether it's with your spouse, whoever it's with, that showing empathy and compassion is the best way to understand another person's perspective. And the way you do that is to listen, is to really listen, and to maybe even go back and go, this is what I hear you saying. So when you're hearing somebody's perspective, say that back to them. This is what I hear you saying. Validating their feelings. I see how that makes you feel that way. I understand. Those words are really important. And then avoid being defensive. And I got to be honest with y'all, this was a hard thing for me, again, because I was so attached to everything, to the school, to all of those things. I was attached to teachers. I felt defensive when people wanted to have something that they didn't like about the school or my teachers or whatever. And the reality is that oftentimes it's not about, most of the time it wasn't about me. And so being defensive just puts me kind of in that autobiographical situation, and that's not a good place to be. So I really encourage that you show empathy and compassion. Brene Brown says that clear is kind, and I think that that's really true. Being willing to be clear about something is a much kinder approach than avoiding. One of the things that I found often would happen is that when you are not clear with someone about your expectations, what you do is you find resentment in yourself, and then you're unkind. And that's where I kind of came to, is that if I could have difficult conversations with people or be direct, I felt less frustration with them and found myself it was easier to be kind. So the next strategy is to build relationships with people. And I think that what this is really about is that when you build relationships with people in your school, then it's easier to have difficult conversations. John Maxwell says, earn the right to be heard by listening to others. Seek to understand a situation before making judgments about it. So that goes back to that question asking conversation, asking questions about, tell me more about this, or tell me more about that, or I'm curious about. When you ask questions like that, people feel more willing to say what they want to say, what they need to say, and you can better understand what the situation is. Taking the time to build relationships with stakeholders. We used to say this to our teachers all the time. If you take the time in the beginning of the year to build relationship with your parents, then if there's something hard that needs to be said, it's easier to say it and it's easier to hear it. So I encourage you to take the time to build relationships. If you're an administrator, take the time to know parents and teachers in a way that isn't conflict oriented. So if all you ever do is have a conversation with somebody around conflict, then you haven't really built a relationship with them, and it's going to be very difficult every time. Anger and frustration are almost always rooted in fear, and I would encourage you to remember that. That's a hard thing, because we think it's anger, but anger and frustration are fear-based, and so if you know that people are afraid, it's easier to go, hey, let's talk about what's real here, and not just assume that you're being attacked. And again, hearing bad news from someone is always easier when you know they care about you. So this strategy, having conversations with your mouth. So that seems a little interesting that I would say that, but I think it's important, especially right now, gosh, in this day and age, we cannot stress enough that texts and emails are a very, very bad way to have a difficult conversation. And I know that sometimes people have to do it that way, especially on an email. I can't imagine a situation in which a text message would be an appropriate way to have a difficult conversation. And sometimes you have to email and then say, I'd like to follow this up with a face-to-face convo. But the reality is that most difficult conversations should take place face-to-face, where you have to have that conversation and you're not emailing. I had many a time where a parent would email a teacher a long drawn out email about what they were mad about. And then the teacher would email back a long drawn out email, and it was back and forth and back and forth. And we couldn't get to a solution. And so I really encourage you to have conversations face-to-face. Also, remember, in the years of social media, things can be screenshot and shared and posted. They can even be altered. I don't know how to do that. I've never done that, but just know that technology is not the safest way. And so it's important to have conversations with your mouth. So do we have any questions that anybody wants to ask? I want to pause right there for just a minute.
So far, no. I think everyone's just kind of taking it in.
Great.
If you have questions, folks, make sure to
absolutely.
the Q&A box, and I'll keep an eye on it.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about climbing the ladder of inference. And this is one of my favorite things. I learned this from Scott Brown. I have to give him props, because he taught me about kind of what the ladder of inference was. And so here's what happens. When you climb the ladder of inference, the first thing you do is you take in all the information. You experience what's happening around you, your feelings. Some get processed, some get filtered. Then you interpret that information. You base it on your own experiences and your own interpretation. You give meaning to it. Then you draw conclusions. These conclusions inform the actions you take and the words you speak, and then you look for signs to reinforce your story. So let me give you an example. I am walking through the hallway, and I see somebody, and I say hello and they don't speak to me, and they just walk past me. And so what I do is I look at that, and maybe I've had a kind of a rough day, or I'm not feeling that good about myself today. And so I think, well, God, that was mean, or that was rude. And I don't pay any attention to what's around me. I just think about, well, gosh, I feel like that they don't like me. So then I begin to interpret the information. I base the information that just what on happened on my own experiences. Well, I think that they've ignored me before. I think that they've not. Last time I was in the hallway and I said hello, they didn't say anything to me. So that must mean that that they're unhappy, or they're unhappy with me. And then I began to really draw conclusions. Gosh, they must hate me. And maybe it's because I gave their child a C on a paper, and it must be because they don't think I'm a good teacher. And then I began to look for signs to reinforce that story that I'm telling myself. Um, Gosh, I must, all those, they're probably telling all the parents that I'm not a good teacher. And in fact, last time I saw so-and-so, they acted like I wasn't a good teacher. So this is an example of how we climb the ladder of inference. And what I'm encouraging you to do is to not do that. What I'm encouraging you to do is to have a conversation. So maybe when that happened in the hallway, what I would rather do is to go to that parent and say, hey, the story I'm telling myself is that you don't like me because I just saw you in the hallway and I said good morning and you didn't speak to me. And so the story I'm telling myself is that you're upset with me or I've done something wrong. And I'd really like to have a conversation about that. That's much better than doing, walking up that ladder and deciding that somebody feels a certain way when they don't. So that's a really important thing. I think this is something we do often. And the best wording that I've ever heard is the story I'm telling myself is. And that way you don't walk into a situation where you're going, oh, you don't like me. You must be mad at me because I gave your kid a C. The story I'm telling myself is this. And then they can go, oh, that's not it at all. I was just late for a meeting, or I was thinking about my parents because they're not doing very well, or whatever. Oftentimes that's going to be the case. Now, sometimes it could be the case that they say, you're right, I don't like you. And you'll have to deal with that.
So sometimes in therapy, that's called cognitive distortions.
Right.
Where it's, we sometimes experience something that may or may not actually be what's happening, but we're really, really good at following that distortion to the next level of distortion. Right. Mm-hmm. And then before you know it, you've reframed that situation where it's not exactly what's going on.
Exactly. And I think we do this pretty regularly without even realizing it. So it goes back to being conscious of yourself. And that kind of speaks to this next strategy, which is to stay healthy. And what I mean by this is that when you are healthy, mind, body, and spirit, it's much easier to put perspective on the conversations that come up on a day-to-day basis. Having a healthy mind means that sometimes you can go and sit down with somebody and talk through a situation, kind of what David's talking about. There were lots of times that I would maybe call in my business manager or go to my priest and say, hey, this is a situation that I'm struggling with, that I feel like maybe there's a problem. Can you help me think through this? And in doing that, you just get somebody else's perspective. I think it's very, I can think of many situations where I would say to, my business manager, so-and-so looks really upset and I think they're mad at me. And she would go, oh no, she had a bad day, or she's got this going on, or whatever. And that really helps. Again, I'm a big fan of especially as a head of school, but in all situations where we're in this pandemic, especially, getting plenty of rest, feeling good physically, getting lots of exercise. Those are all things that help you feel better, which gives you a better perspective. I don't know I can promise you I need lots of sleep. And so many times, if I haven't slept, I don't see anything right. My perspective is usually warped across the board. So I encourage you to take care of yourself physically. And then finally, having a healthy spirit, understanding people, loving people requires lots and lots of prayer and grace, especially right now. So at this time, I'd like to just entertain any questions. David, any thoughts that you would like to offer?
Again, I mean, I think that the two things that really stand out for me this time, one, silence, that idea
Mhm.
of um, making sure you're not uncomfortable with a little bit of space in these conversations. That's the first
Right.
thing. Second thing we've already talked about, either the ladder of inference or the whole cognitive distortion piece, because it is so easy, especially with creative people, to go
Yes.
from, one little thing, and then before you know it, it's completely become the creation of something that just doesn't match reality. And that can really be an issue as well. The other thing that really comes to mind is we talked about preparing yourself emotionally.
Mhm.
And I think part of it also goes to sometimes we find ourselves in difficult conversation that may or may not be the right time for that conversation to take place.
Right.
And so I think we always need to give ourselves permission to, and this happens in parent conversations, for example. I think we need to give ourselves permission to identify, you know what, this conversation maybe needs to take place in a time when we're not so unprepared emotionally, if that makes sense,
Right.
when emotions are not at a 9 or a 10. And so lots of times the most constructive thing you can do is say, you know what, I understand you're very upset. I'm hearing what you're saying. I'm wondering if we need to schedule a time we can really have a conversation about this. So I would just make sure some difficult conversations as they're unfolding right then and there may or may not be the time for that conversation, and
Yeah.
give yourself the permission to identify that and reschedule it. I mean, some conversations you can't reschedule, but lots of
Right.
conversations you can.
Yeah, I think there's real merit in that. And I think it's something that we don't give ourselves permission to do. You know, I mean, even in a situation where you have an irate parent, guess what? Probably not a lot's going to go well on that. And I'm not suggesting that you say, oh, well, I'm not speaking to you till you calm down. But there's sometimes that you have to say, you know what? This is not going anywhere and we need to stop. And let's schedule to meet again tomorrow. Um, because otherwise it's just going to be, and I know we've all been in those situations where you've had an irate parent or an irate situation where it was out of control, and you have to have permission to be able to stop that and go, this isn't okay.
Carpool line,
Hmm.
not a time for a difficult conversation. Drop off in the hallway, not a time for a
Yeah.
difficult conversation. So yeah, I think that sometimes as administrators and as faculty, we have to kind of think through the timing of those.
Yeah.
We've got a couple comments here. Here's one. I found that many times as you try to moderate, that the other person will get personally insulted towards you or the teacher. Yeah, and the challenge with this is, I mean, we're dealing with people's most precious commodity, their
Hmm.
kid.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
yeah, thoughts on what happens if it shifts to where it becomes personally insulting, MK.
Yeah,
To
I mean, I always said to my teachers, and I did it myself. If we're going to get personal, it's over. It's over. We're not going to have we're time out. We're going to stop the conversation right now because we need to problem solve here. We're not going to get insulting. And so if that's the way it's going to go, I think that's definitely the time in which you want to take time out, reschedule, or do whatever. And I think that's true whether you're dealing with a teacher situation, you're dealing with a parent. And that's probably the reason that most people get so anxious around a difficult conversation, is because they're afraid of that.
Sure.
One of the things I think also you should pay attention to, and this is something we've talked about a lot, is kind of your wiring. I think about we talk about the Enneagram and whether it's you've done Enneagram or you've done DISC or whatever, you need to know yourself well enough to know how you respond to conflict. And I think it's important to pay attention to um, not just what you're good at, but what you're not good at. And what I learned very quickly is that I needed to be better at listening. I was not a good listener. I'm a problem solver. Here's another problem I had. I'm a quick processor and a quick thinker. And so what would appear to be a totally good solution to me, the other party had not gotten to yet. And so because I would go into, and I can remember specifically a situation with a parent where I had met with the parent and I thought I went in with the solution, right? We're going to meet. I've got the solution. We're going to solve your problem and everybody's going to be happy. And we did that. We met. Here's the solution. Everybody seemed happy. They walked out. I'm like, it was great.
Yeah.
How did it go? It went great. The parent walked straight out, texted about 10 of her friends and said, I'm a terrible listener. I don't listen. She didn't get a chance to talk. Now, some of it she probably said was not true. That's okay. But you know what? That my learning there had to do with not necessarily that I didn't solve the problem, but that I just didn't give her the chance to talk and to listen. And so I think back to your point about that awkward silence, or just because I process quickly doesn't mean you do.
That's right.
And so giving somebody that silence, that moment, God, it's powerful. Hard, but powerful.
The other thing that comes to mind on this topic is that we tend to remember the real disasters in this area. So we tend to, every single one of us has been in difficult conversations that did not go well.
Right.
And we tend to really, really remember those.
Right.
So we probably need to work at getting kind of having a bad memory on some of those, because the way conversations have gone in the past may or may not be what happens at the next difficult conversation you have.
Right.
And so the dynamics are different. You're a different person. The person you're working with on the other side is different. So I do think it's helpful to try to start with a fresh slate and try not to let the past frame the conversation that you're planning for next, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I would say this too. This is a skill. This is not something everybody, no matter how you're wired, no matter kind of your personality or whatever, every single person can get better at this kind of situation where you can get better at a difficult conversation. You can get better at listening. You can get better at empathizing. You can get better at all of it. And it's definitely something that I don't want anybody to walk away going, well, Mary Catherine's, she's more assertive or she's more direct. Yes, that's something, but I can assure you that there are lots of areas where I just had to really practice listening, practice giving people the time to talk. You just have to practice. So
what about reading? We've got a request for any books, suggested books for reading on this. What have you run across?
I read a book called Fierce Conversations that was really good. I even went to a Fierce Conversations webinar and or PD conference on it, and it's a really good book. I'm sure there are more ones out there, and certainly I can do some research, because to my knowledge, I'm just thinking the Fierce Conversations is my favorite one.
That's the one that I've heard the most about, and the most.
It's good.
That I've had schools use with faculty.
Yes.
A handful of our schools that have used Fierce Conversations or some of the tools from Fierce Conversation in PD days or faculty in service days.
Yeah.
So I've had one school that took that book on and said it's going to be a faculty read.
Yeah.
And the entire faculty read that, and every month they looked at different chapters as well. So
Yeah.
there's tons on the topic. Fierce Conversations is probably the one that I hear the most about.
I think there's also value in doing some professional development with your faculty, with your administrators around this particular thing, having conversations, learning about how to do that. Role playing, I think, is important. I think there's real value in staff development around how to have hard conversations.
I was typing an answer to it, but I'll go ahead and just to share with everyone. And a participant said that, part of the challenging part of this is that people get offended so quickly.
Yep, they
And
do.
so I think you have to, what I was going to say in response was, yeah, I don't think you can ever go wrong with saying, it looks as if I've offended you, or I'm sensing I've offended you. That's not my intent.
Yeah,
I'm sorry that you're taking it that way, but I want to be very clear. I'm not saying this to offend you. I'm saying this because, and then insert what your
right.
motive is. I'm saying this because we've got to find a solution that works for both of us better. I'm
Yeah,
saying because I honestly want what's best for your child, and the way things are unfolding right now, I'm concerned that your child's not getting what he or she needs,
yeah,
whatever. And I think you have to call that out. There's no way for you to control if the other person gets offended. You can't control their emotions,
right.
can't control how they're going to respond. All you can control is being as nonplussed and prepared as possible in how you're communicating it, and then being as transparent as possible in what your intent is, and just trying to hold a mirror up to, I'm sensing I've offended you. That's not what I'm trying to do. I know this is a difficult conversation, but I want us to talk about this because, and insert your intent there. What else, MK, on that topic? I don't really
Well,
know another
I
way to
think,
handle that.
yeah, I think the other piece of that is just simply being unwilling to get offended yourself and
That's hard.
defensive.
Yeah.
Like if somebody's offended by something you're saying, it's easy to get defensive because they're offended by what you just said, right? And it's kind of like I said earlier, part of what always made me feel defensive was my absolute attachment to my teachers or my school or the policies that we had in place, because I felt personally like if you didn't like our policies, or if you thought my school wasn't good, then you didn't like me.
Yeah.
And the reality is, if you can disconnect yourself from that and you can just listen without judgment, which is very hard to do, then what happens is you're less likely to be, there's less likely to have offensiveness. But the reality is that that's the world we live in right now
Well,
is,
and yeah, people are going to get offended and they're going to say nasty things in
yeah,
response. That's when we get a little theological, and we're talking about, you shared Rob Bell with me on death by paper
yep,
cuts, and this idea that if we're not intentional about how we manage that, all those tiny little slights, all those tiny little barbs that we get within the context of these conversations will really start to take their toll. And so the theological strategy is, we've got to become masters of forgiveness and realize, that was not my intent to offend the other person, but I said what I felt needed to be said. That was taken as me offending them, and they said something nasty back to me. I've got a whole multiple choice multiple choices of how I can choose to respond to that.
right,
And at that point, you've got to say, one of those multiple choice answers is, forgive this person, and I don't know what's going on with them, but I can't take it personally. It
yeah,
still hurts, and I got to deal with that internally with me, but I'm not gonna take it personally. But you're right. I mean, people just get offended, and when people get offended, it's the whole fight or flight thing,
right.
and yeah, it can get ugly really, really quickly.
Well, and I think, to fine tune your point about theological approach, I think for me, having difficult conversations, the whole forgiveness piece revolved around my own spiritual health. And whether you are, no matter what role you're in here, if you're an administrator, if you're a head of school, if you're a teacher, your spiritual health matters. And so being able to forgive people, um, what it does for you is it releases you from worrying about whether somebody likes you or not, whether somebody thinks you're being direct and honest and straightforward, and you're also giving lots of grace and lots of forgiveness, but you're not attached. I have a friend who said, who talked to me at one time about don't, do the very best you can, but don't be attached to the outcome. The other thing he said to me pretty regularly was hold attention gently, either negative or positive. So hold it gently and go, you know what? I see you're upset, but I have to say these things, and I want us to continue in a good relationship. And so I'm going to forgive your bad reaction. I'm going to forgive all of that.
But you can't, in my opinion, you can't forgive if spiritually your cup is empty.
That's correct. You're absolutely right.
You can't.
Can't
so,
do it.
So whatever feeds you spiritually, if it's, spending time with scripture, quiet time, meditation, whatever that is, worship is different right now since most of us are in distance, but whatever it is that feeds you spiritually,
Right.
you can't forgive if you are not deep in your relationship with God, in my opinion. Now, again, I don't want to get too preachy at you, but I think that's part of the whole equation here.
I think it's the foundation of the whole thing. If having difficult conversations is a part of life, and the way we respond to it or the way we receive it, it's all relative to how this, how we feel internally, how we are internally, and it doesn't make it perfect, but it does make it much, much easier.
Yeah.
So, yep.
Well, we're coming up to the top of the hour, so last call on any questions. Type those into the Q&A box. I put this in the chat. If any of you are having a difficulty seeing the slides, please don't worry. There's going to be a copy of the slides in the webinar. I'm sorry, in the document library. Give us a day or so. It normally takes us about a day to get it loaded up. But thank you all so much for being here. Mary Katherine, thank you for sharing your wisdom on this topic.
Well, unfortunately, I have some experience in doing it poorly. So it's my pleasure to take those bad experiences and hopefully impart it to somebody else.
Well, thank you all so much for being with us today.